Welcome to the Great Humbling Podcast. I'm Dougal Tyne, and since 2020 I've been recording these conversations with my friend Ed Gillespie. We start where our work meets and the places it takes us, the things that we're reading, the things that are getting us thinking, circling around the thought that these times in which we're living might be a humbling, a time of being brought down to earth and changed by the impact. Thank you for listening. All right, we're recording. Ed, welcome back. This must be episode 3 of the ongoing, deepening, greatening, humbling. How you doing?
I'm good. You're looking very Wes Anderson in your symmetry today. It's like you somewhere perfectly framed yourself, so you're smack bang in the middle. I like it. Yeah, there's a total asymmetry at this end. Perhaps this is the difference. You're very aligned between your polarities, and I'm just somewhere in the chaos.
Well, you must be coming to the end of the season in which it's viable to be sitting out there in your admittedly very well-equipped shed.
Yeah.
Ed, how are you doing? Are you shivering over there?
Oh, and it's not quite frost in the beard yet, but it's definitely chilly today. I think this is the final week before the transition indoors. And if I had the hot water bottle out, I'd have it on my toes right now because they're feeling a little bit chilly.
When it gets below -10 here, I go off to take Alfie to school and come back and take a selfie of my beard, looking as though I've been on a polar expedition, though slightly more wisely dressed than the British polar explorers, I think.
I like the way you're now comparing the school run to a polar expedition.
Yeah, all right. That's
the over dramatization of the Scandinavian school run.
Oh, well, what's been going on, Ed? What have you been up to before we get to events in the wider world, obviously?
What have I been up to? So I've been reading, well, actually, this sort of leads into a bit of what's happening in the wider world. So I think mentioned last time, I've been just delving into Derek Gow's Birds, Beasts and Bedlam. But there was a bit in there which just sort of summed up the mood, I think, for the last couple of weeks. So he's talking about water voles and the reintroduction of water voles. And, we're very proud neighbours to a water vole that sits quite happily in the middle of the river during the summer, oblivious to what's going on around him or her, and just munches away at the reeds and the rushes right in the middle of the stream here. And you can sort of wave to him, he just sort of looks up and just goes, yeah, whatever. But apparently I've learned through reading Derek's book that water voles create communal latrines. So they come onto the bank and they all poo in the same place. Obviously something to do with territory and bonding, but the idea is that you can tell where you've got water voles because you get these little piles of green poo. And then Derek said the best example of this he'd seen was on a canal in London, where there was a body of a dead fox floating in the canal, and all the local water voles had piled a heap of poo on the dead fox's head. And he said, it just felt a bit dystopian. And I thought, yeah, that's my mood this week. Basically, a dead fox floating in a canal with a pile of water vole poo on its head.
Well, full marks for managing to get the excremental vision in to keep the vibe of this season. Alfie and Anna and I went to see I presume it's called The Wild Robot in.
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah. It came to our little Sunday cinema here in Astavola yesterday afternoon, and so somehow the image of the water voles pooing on the floating body of the fox is getting tangled up, and getting animated for me in my head in the style of that film. Thanks for implanting that, Ed.
Did you enjoy Wild Robot?
Yeah, I felt like I need to think about it a bit more. but just as a film and a piece of storytelling.
There's
Yes.
some stunning moments in it. I mean, the kids when we went loved it. I was in proper granddad mode because I don't know what they've done in cinemas now, and I'm going to sound like totally like a 52-year-old man, but it was so loud. It was like it was punishingly loud, though. I mean, like, and for kids, I was like, well, this is like massive attack live loud. You know,
Wow.
I could sort of feel it in my chest. Um, but yeah, that's somewhat detracted, but some of the imagery in it was gorgeous.
Yeah. Yes. And quite what's going on, like quite what I mean, it's a little bit like the Lego movie where somehow the instructions are the enemy and President Business.
Yeah, yeah.
That's sort of rather prophetic because since the Lego movie one was made a long while before Donald Trump made his way to the White House the first time around, somehow you're kind of put under this spell that makes you lulls you into imagining that Lego is the kind of the little guy, the David standing up against the Goliath, as if the instructions are not entirely inherent in the whole logic of Lego, and as if Lego isn't a massive, oil-based, plastic-based, corporate multimedia, multi-platform giant. And I say this as somebody whose living room has been home to a substantial Lego collection that I've been partially responsible for the accumulation of over years. But
Do you take the instructions off Alfie then?
no, but what I tell you what, he mostly uses the Lego characters and plays out these long, ongoing
Argus.
stories with them. So honestly, he could be. He's doing something that has been done for millennia using stickmen that happens to be done around here just now, and that's just because the kind of kid he is that he happens to get more into the stories with the little men than the building and the engineering part of Lego. But anyway, yes, that's those have been the accumulated fruits of his birthdays over recent years. I think there's some kind of Lego embargo now on new Lego coming into our household. But anyway, I had a birthday this weekend. Anna ran into one of our friends locally last week who was coming over for the party and said, "Oh, it's not a big birthday, is it? It's not like a round number birthday." It wasn't. No, it was a prime number birthday. One of those ones that don't fit into any recurring pattern. But I did discover that 47 is apparently a good age at which to start a whiskey collection. And I mentioned
agree.
I mentioned this partly because you know how mentors give you advice.
Yeah.
Well, and regular listeners will know that Alistair McIntosh is one of those people who has been in that kind of role for me over the years. When I stayed with Alistair on last year's British book tour, he said, Dougal, it's very important that you mention your fondness for whiskey in your books, because then your readers know how to thank you. And I looked around at this array of whiskey bottles in the Whiskey Club, which is where you end up if you stay at Alistair's house and you sit up late talking together. And I thought, I'm going to take on board that advice. So I'm preparing for that by mentioning it on the podcast.
There we go. At work in the ruins of your own whiskey collection. Yeah. It's sage advice. I always tend to acquire more whiskey when I do my annual Burns night supper, because I encourage people to bring interesting whiskies. So I've got, Japanese, Indian, Welsh. There's even a Norfolk whiskey now. So yeah, gone beyond Scots and Irish.
Indeed. Well, there we go. So we'll have to institute a Burns night supper here in the shoe shop. We're doing an English Advent fika with mince pies and Christmas carols in mid-December. So we're starting to get back in. We've had a little bit of a break from doing in-person events here in the shoe shop because we just threw ourselves into the Skogsvallen, the folk park, the music venue this year. But it feels like it's sort of time to start doing those things again. I'm just looking around at what I've got that I've been reading, and I seem to be reading things that I can talk about, but you won't be able to listeners won't be able to get their hands on, or at least not just yet.
Such a tease.
I know, yeah. So here, this I'm sure is not going to be the actual cover when the book comes out in February, but this is Andy Hamilton's New Wild Order: How Answering the Call of the Wild Might Just Save Your Life and Sanity. Do you know Andy? He seems like someone you would have crossed paths with, Ed.
I don't know. Well, the name sounds familiar, but then I think there's quite a lot of Andy Hamiltons out there.
Well, that's probably true. Yeah, but he's foraging. He's the big foraging guy and wild brewing and I'm halfway through.
A really successful forager. I mean,
yeah, I think we need to send you on a how answering the call of the wild and going foraging might save your life rather than poison yourself, Ed.
Exactly, or almost kill you.
We'll send you to Andy for some re-education. But no, it's a really good read. It's kind of a memoir style book. There's just a lovely kind of ordinary bloke-ishness about Andy writing about like finding ways of staying sane through letting the wild in, even when you're living just in a very ordinary modern context, and some great storytelling in it. And it did make me laugh at one point where he has about 8 pages of telling this story about how he's been sort of experimenting with microdosing with fly agarics. And then after 8 pages, he goes, and I did then just talk to a doctor friend who pointed out that they've been seeing heart issues developing amongst middle-aged men who have been experimenting with microdosing with fly agarics. So maybe I'm not going to encourage you to try this one at home, kids. But he left in an honest account of the good that it did his mental health anyway. But yeah, so that's been on my reading. Anything else that you've been reading, Ed? What's been getting you thinking?
I think I mean, to be honest, I have to confess, I've probably read too much like post-US election analysis. I think I've probably just been trawling through a lot of that. I had to give a talk like the morning after, and it was at the top of the Gherkin in the city of London, and the Gherkin, we had this anticyclonic fog and cloud bank that sat over the UK for about a week and a half, which was really oppressive, when you've got that very low, thick cloud. I think it was something like 800 meters deep, this cloud. It was really oppressive. And of course, the Gherkin was sort of stuck up right in the middle of it. So what should have been this sort of glitzy event for this company's 50th birthday that I was speaking at, turned into this very gloomy, slightly dystopian, oppressive room. So you're sat, it's glass all the way 360, and all you could see was a whiteout. It was like, this is the Trump vibe. So I was doing that, and then I went for a long walk. Actually, I had an American friend visiting who had to come over here on a business trip, and he'd deliberately timed his business trip so he'd be in the air on the night of the election, so he wouldn't watch it. And of course, he landed at Heathrow and went, great. So we did a 15-mile hike on Tuesday last week, all along the River Yare, the Wherryman's Way, the old trade route, the principal trade route out of East Anglia, out of Norfolk, which would have been everything going along the river. And that was quite cathartic to just walk and talk like pretty much all day. It was a 5 or 6 hour hike. And yeah, I felt like I let go of some of the baggage after that, but it was very difficult. I think after we recorded the previous episode,
with my terribly successful election prediction.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you weren't alone. I mean, it's just the echoes of the last 8 years, which tied back into what we were saying about George Marshall's work, which felt quite topical about how you bring people into this conversation from right across the political spectrum. But just the sense that, 2016 was an aberration, whereas this time around it just felt like a real choice.
Well, let's dive into that in a minute. I've got a couple of other bits of reading equally. This one's even harder to get your hands on. The Andy Hamilton book is like, wait till February and then it'll be in all good bookshops. Look at this. This was given to me when I was on my American tour in September. Now, firstly, and Dark Mountain readers will know this. I love books that don't have any words on the cover. There's never any words on the cover of a classic Dark Mountain book. An autumn special issue will have one word on the cover. This has no words anywhere on the spine or anything. And then you open it inside. And by the way, this was given to me by a reader who came to an event. And in fact, I was given so many books in the course of the American tour that I had to appeal for an extra suitcase. And bless him, Don Blair, who I think won the prize for the attendance record because he managed to make it to 3 different events in the course of the tour. The last event that he came to, he brought me an extra suitcase to take home all of the books that I had been being given in the course of the tour. So I'm slowly in the process of exploring the treasures that I came home with. But this is 999 Years of Peace by James Kalan. Only edition, published by Cartoon Distortion, printed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, not for sale. And here it says at the front, by bankrolling the production of the first and only 132 copies of this book that will probably ever exist, a never to be named rich boy has purchased so many plenary indulgences. May they move him no closer to heaven. If you find your name on the opposite page, the author, the publisher, or a fellow reader hoped your skimming this might tip you closer towards insert radical action here. When you're done, write in the person whom you feel this text might most delight, inspire, anger, destabilize, and give it away. Number 105 of 132. And here we have the list of names, and I'm the third name down. And I sat down and started reading this morning. I'm 50 pages into this novel of the next 1,000 years. And so far, I got through the first story because it's sort of a novel that feels a bit like a patchwork of different stories. And I was remembering my days as a hands-on editor at Dark Mountain and how good fiction that answered the questions that Dark Mountain was asking was actually always the hardest thing to find. And I was going, damn, I wish that James Kalan had found his way to us in those years at Dark Mountain, but I hope that if he hasn't already been, that he will be published in the pages of Dark Mountain before too long. But just the idea of this incredibly beautiful object that is a book that was 10 years in the writing, that exists in 132 copies, never to be sold, to be passed from hand to hand, it's an interesting spell to be putting out into the world. And I think one thing that I found myself saying after the election, the American election, was I'm glad that I was back in America in September and was reminded of how many Americas there are. Because if I was trying to absorb and make sense of and be with these times with just the America that we hear about, just the America that fills the analysis that, pumps into our brains in the aftermath of an event like the election, I would feel, what do I want to say? More desperate, probably. There is so much of the world, even in the few countries that get to dominate the international headlines, that is missing from the stories and analyses and ways of representing that, command our attention. And, this is one strange little undertaking from one layer within all of the adventures that I went on in September. The other thing that I'd been reading that also you can't get your hands on, but I will try and encourage this being put out into the world, is Elizabeth Oldfield sent me the text or shared with a few of us, the text of the talk that she gave at the Kairos Club in London last week. And I read it and found it really helpful. And I think anyone who's coming from, I mean, obviously, Kairos convenes people around climate and the ecological crisis and all of the questions worth asking in relation to that. And regular listeners will know Liz Oldfield is, she's the author of Fully Alive, a brilliant book that is an attempt to share the treasures of the Christian tradition that she stands in and speaks from with those who may never darken the door of a church. And the talk that she gave was a particularly good building of bridges, I thought, to those who are coming from the kind of movements that you and I have been involved in, and maybe just kind of church curious or something, but also like wanting to understand what it is that those who have thrown themselves deeply, loudly, publicly into Christianity in recent years are finding there. I think Liz's talk might be very helpful for those who have been puzzled by that as well. So I will try and encourage her to put that online, but also listeners who are within the orbit of London. The Kairos Club does have a wonderful lineup of guests. And I mean, our friend Rupert Reed is going to be speaking there on the 26th. Ellie Robbins, who some may know because her Substack went a little bit viral in the summer, writing wonderful stuff about the imaginal, is speaking there on November the 28th. And also, if you go to a Kairos event in the near future, they have a stack of paperback copies of At Work in the Ruins on sale for £10, which is less than you will get them for in all good bookshops, because I left them with a stack when I was there recently. So yeah, if you're in London, check out what's going on. I think it's kairos.london is the website, but we'll stick it in the show notes. So yeah, there we go. Those are some of the things that have been sort of running through my.
You're allowed one book plug per episode.
Thank you.
So Boris Johnson got thrown off Channel 4 News on the night of the US election for repeatedly plugging his biography. Christian and Guru Murti, they came back after an ad break, and they said Boris Johnson has left the show this evening for repeatedly plugging his book.
There we go. If only it was so easy to eject politicians who get up your nose.
No, and I've felt, there was a Turkish writer who I've mentioned on the podcast, I think Elif Shafak. She shared a Turkish proverb, which you'll probably recognize, which is, the trees kept voting for the axe, for the axe was clever and convinced the trees that because his handle was made of wood, he was one of them. And I need to go back and reread Ecce Temelkaran, I think, How to Lose a Country, because there feels like an aspect of that to where we are now, writing about the Turkish sort of authoritarian experience.
I mean, so I guess I want to go quite gently in talking about any of this because we both live a long way away.
Yeah.
And I've been talking with people who are everywhere along the spectrum. No, not everywhere along the spectrum exactly. But from those who are panicked and traumatized by the election result through to those who are resigned or ambivalent about it, let's say. And obviously the spectrum continues a good way beyond that. And I haven't been talking to very many people who are towards the enthused and jubilant end of it, I'll admit. But nonetheless, I'm kind of just aware of the different places that people are at. And you already said something about 2016 being or feeling like or getting packed away as if it had been an aberration. And maybe the thing, I was quoting from R.G. Miga in the last episode, and a certain kind of impatience in what he was saying that has to do with that thing of, it's precisely the unwillingness to learn the lessons of 2016, precisely the smugness with which in 2020 there was all, the grown-ups are back in charge, as if it was an aberration that had been packed away, as if there was nothing more to lean into and try and learn from that lays the ground for where we are now. And RG Ryan is his name. I mean, he writes as RG Meager, but we sat down 2 days after the election and had a go at recording an episode of Homeward Bound, our sister podcast to this, and he said, "Does this make me the American politics correspondent of the Great Humbling?" We, by mutual decision, we canned that episode. We didn't put it out, partly because it didn't feel like what the world needs now is more analysis. Partly because we found ourselves repeating things that we tried to say 8 years ago and going like, there's no way in which repeating this helps, because if it hasn't landed, then. But he wrote a comment on our last episode, Ed, the episode that we recorded on November the 5th on election day, and I thought I'd just read you a little bit of that. And he was talking about polarization, and he said, here in America and maybe in the rest of the Western world, we're having a very hard time breaking the mental habit of dividing people into liberal and conservative. We're well past the point of those old terms being incoherent as far as describing people's actual attitude. There are some conversations exploring the authoritarian center and the populist periphery as the real site of conflict. And that's useful up to a point, but carries too much moral judgment in both directions. For my money, Ryan says, at least in the US, the conflict seems to be between people who see their country as a unique territory and those who see it as one national franchise in a globalized overculture. I'm absolutely not a Trump supporter. However, I sympathize more and more with people who would traditionally be considered conservative, because I see how little their values are reflected in the national discourse. Oftentimes they get labeled as bigots or white supremacists for no other reason than not wanting to move where the jobs are. They want the jobs to be where they are, which doesn't seem like an unreasonable expectation in what was recently one of the richest countries on the planet. They don't want their small town to be more like Brooklyn. They don't subscribe to the kind of cultural chauvinism that sees every community in some stage of arrested development along the path to becoming the same kind of futuristic cosmopolitan enclave. A big part of the Democratic Party's failure for the past 8 years, in my view, has been the utter failure, maybe unwillingness or inability, to translate their policies into terms that Americans by choice can appreciate. I think he means by that people who feel that where they come from is who they are, rather than identities being things you put on and off by choice. It's always assumed that everybody is equally excited about applying for membership in the Galactic Federation when the time comes. These celebrations of diversity and inclusion and constant mobility within a globalized overculture implicitly and sometimes explicitly treat it as a practice run for a Star Trek-style techno-utopia, where the sacrifice is required: death of local communities, loss of blue-collar jobs, demonization of traditional values, are equally understood as maybe unfortunate but necessary, and then any resistance to that assumption is immediately cast as bigotry or hostile nationalism, because the opposing side sees their own values as universal. Now, I don't want to say that's the whole of the story. I don't think Ryan would want to say it's the whole of the story, and I've got another bit that I'll bring in later, bringing a different voice, a different set of reflections on the election. But I appreciate the kind of willingness to lean in and ask, what are the failures that lay the ground for this, rather than just make it all about those bad people or those idiots. And that's kind of where my patience with the sort of the trees voting for the axe kind of rhetoric wears a little bit thin. I don't want to, like I say, I don't want to go heavy on any of this because I'm a long way away. It's just that sometimes I think that there are stories that are a bit too easy that we tell ourselves, that don't recognize the extent to which the responsibility for this shit lies on the side of those who want to see themselves as the good guys as well.
Yeah.
And also, yeah, go for it, Ed.
Well, it's like, it is a matter of perspective also, isn't it? I mean, the other quote that was being rattling around in my head is the Aristotle one, which is, the guest will judge better of a feast than the cook. And there seemed to be a lot of cooking going on which may not necessarily please the guests. And that's entirely their prerogative, as you say, coming from from the position of their own personal felt experience. And my sense in that sort of David Graeber way of, the world being made of stories that we make and we make them differently at any time. I think the discombobulation that I feel to a certain extent is it suddenly feels like the story has been rewritten in a way that it didn't anticipate.
Mhm.
So there's the story in which, as you say, dominant media or the big analysis take starts to manifest as is not one I recognize. And maybe that is to do also with the geographic distance, and not having the felt experience from a shed in Norfolk, and not really understanding some of that American complexity.
So let's talk about something else that we spoke about a few weeks ago, and I thought would be worth us bringing to an episode, which is a question that came from our mutual friend Brian Eno, at a gathering that I was part of when I was in London the other week. And he said to me, all of this talk about ruins, he said, what I worry about is if I have to accept that there's a collapse that can't be prevented and that it's from the ruins that we have to build. He said, how different is that to accelerationism? And that, I thought, was a really good question that I've been wanting to chew on a little bit more than there was the chance for in that event. And so firstly, I mean, Ed, what does the word accelerationism conjure up for you? Is it a word that's that's been in the mix of things you've been thinking about, hearing about, reading about, talking about over the years?
Well, certainly. I mean, I would use the term exponentials. I think we're talking about the same thing. And for a long time in my talks, I used to talk about the battle of exponentials. It's like an exponential crisis being met by an exponential shift in awareness, consciousness, technology, and all the other things needed to meet that. I was to say this was a while ago now. I would say
Sure.
this was stuff I would have been talking around about 10 years ago, where, it's like, how do we address the kind of the crossing of those two exponentials, an ecological and climate and social emergency, along with the means of trying to address that. I'm obviously less in that camp now, but certainly that kind of accelerationism it feels like what we're experiencing very much in the notion of technology, as we alluded to in the last couple of episodes, where you have this accelerated pace. We have the need for accelerated growth. We've got an administration in the UK which is using growth as the kind of panacea to solve all of the socioeconomic problems and indeed some of the environmental ones. And we've spoken in depth about that sort of paradox. So yeah, that's accelerationism fills me with a sort of fear.
That's what it evokes for you. Okay, that's helpful to hear, because it's sort of one of these terms that I've watched it move. So 10 years ago, maybe a bit more, it was a term that was associated with the left. There was a thing called the Accelerate Manifesto, or even the hashtag Accelerate Manifesto. I think that's how they wrote it, which tells you what era it was coming out of. And it was partly coming out of a kind of Marxist rhetoric that says, late capitalism is stuck. We've got stuck in a loop. And what we need is an injection of sort of some kind of revolutionary Marxism that will unlock it and start history moving forward again. And, the tame end of that was sort of Paul Mason. You can go to fully automated luxury communism as the kind of more colorful version of it. But it was 10 or 12 years ago, the primary use of this concept of accelerationism was on the left. And then you also got sort of factions within that, whether it was acceleration in terms of saying like the developmental evolution of human history has got stuck and we need to restart it, or whether it was, we need to accelerate into things falling apart. And that definitely got stronger over the years as a theme within the rhetoric of accelerationism. You also had figures like Nick Land, who is associated with this kind of, I can't remember the name of it, but basically it must have been at Warwick University. I want to say that in the 90s, there was this kind of lab doing tech and politics and social science or social theory stuff, which is also like where Mark, oh gosh, capitalist realism, Mark Fisher came out of that scene as well. Nick Land kind of veered off, and this is where where accelerationism starts to get associated with the right instead. And so when Brian was invoking it the other week, for him, from now or recently, the association of accelerationism is to scary far right. Not least some of the kind of weirder elements of the alt-right that are kind of outriders of the Trump thing, wanting to kind of crash things, wanting to provoke, maybe wanting to provoke a race war. That's a version of accelerationism as well. And so Brian's question was, if I have to give up, and he was really describing what he's wrestling with, I think, if I have to kind of give up the idea that we can rescue or make sustainable, create a good version of this society of techno-modernity that I see around me, and that the things worth working for will be what you build out of the ruins of this, then am I not falling into the same logic of, we need to put our foot to the floor and crash this thing? And I'm just, I guess I'm curious how that lands with you. I've got some thoughts on it myself, but what's that bringing to mind from the conversations you've been part of?
It's interesting. Well, I've obviously been part of some of the same conversations at Hard Art that have touched on these kind of challenges. I hadn't perhaps come across the use of the term in quite the same way. Maybe I was operating in a slightly sort of parallel sense, which is why I immediately went to the exponentials. But I get the gist of where it's coming from. I mean, again, it's a quandary, isn't it? Because if you're not in favor of one thing, does that necessarily mean you're in favor of the other? Like, so as Brian's sort of highlighting, it's like, well, if I'm not rescuing a softer, kinder, more globally connected and ecologically wise modern system, then am I necessarily required to rush headlong into dismantling and destroying that as fast as possible in order to birth what will really come next? And I guess that, the Gramsci quote has been doing a lot of this week, or in the last 2 weeks.
The eternal interregnum.
The eternal interregnum. Well, I know, and you alluded to it in the last episode. It's like that it could last a very long time, of these morbid symptoms. So it's perhaps not surprising if it feels chaotic and messy that people would come at the idea of accelerating change either to crash it and bring more chaos in order to break the institutions or the organizations that they feel are stopping the world that they want to see being born, or vice versa, to remove those institutions and allow the next world to be born. And I think that's one of those weird circles joining up in the strangest of places, isn't it? Where you can feel like a whole political spectrum bending back on itself and people at the far left and the far right occupying very similar ground.
Well, so I guess where I want to go with this is I sometimes say, if you want an image for where we're at, then maybe the image is of a machine that's going faster and faster and starting to come apart.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, it is intensifying, it is going faster and faster. The extraction, the outputs, etc., look like you're on some trajectory of inevitability if you focus on that part of it. it's also flying apart and people are being hit by the pieces coming off it. So that image is an attempt to contain a little bit of the complexity of where we might be within the trajectory of all of this. I'm curious because you said a softer, kinder, more globally connected and ecologically wise to describe the thing that you might be trying to save or make sustainable. And I think maybe just unbundling or noticing the strangeness of the idea that those things belong together in a bundle.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
our kind of high-tech global interconnection is somehow bringing us towards softness and kindness and ecological wisdom doesn't feel immediately obvious to me.
No, it doesn't. And again, I think I'm echoing stuff that perhaps I used to say a long time ago.
Hmm.
Well, when there was still that degree of idealism, which the real politic and the real experience has fundamentally undermined. Not least with the sort of acceleration of disinformation and the ability to live in completely fragmented and parallel worlds.
Yeah. So here's the answer that I came to in a sort of, esprit d'escalier.
Yeah.
Uh, wonderful French phrase for the thought that comes to you as you're walking down the staircase after you've sort of stormed out of the room and slammed the door behind you. So I didn't storm out of the room. I was very happy to have Brian bring this trouble to the language of ruins. But the thought that came to me in the days afterwards was, I think I want to speak for decelerationism. And it was partly because among the other people who was in this conversation was Iona Lawrence from the Decelerator, which is a fascinating organization that has been, you know, building on lessons from Hospicing Modernity, Vanessa's book, and also at work in the ruins, but applying it really practically in the third sector, as they say in the UK, to that question of how do we give things good endings? And that's part of what I loved the first time I ever met Vanessa and heard her use that phrase, hospicing modernity. And that was 2018. I was like, yes, this is naming something that I've been kind of reaching towards since the early days of Dark Mountain. But it's just pinned it or just given it this name that makes it snap into focus. Because hospicing modernity is precisely not either pretending that you can save it, salvage it, make it sustainable, that all of the good in human history rides on us managing to keep going these trajectories, because I don't believe that. Nor is it trying to burn it down, bring it down, smash it, stage a revolution. It's something weirder, it's something trickier, it's something actually kinder and more generous, saying this needs to be given a good ending, both in limiting the damage that is done in its ending and in releasing the good things that we want to take forward from the ways we've been doing things around here lately.
It's funny, isn't it? When you phrase it like that, I mean, obviously the idea of slowing down is something which is very dear to my heart. Having revived and revisited literally the notion of slow travel in a big way earlier in my career. So I'm very interested in slowing stuff down. But when you were talking about that it brings to mind a really recent example in terms of deceleration and good endings. So a few years ago, pre-pandemic, I was involved in a small business which was a sort of spin out from an anti-plastics campaign, which was selling metal water bottles, and 5 or 6 years ago, that was a relatively novel thing. But the whole idea was, and also I was involved with Shambhala Festival, which had been plastic free for a long time. So it was about, how do we get every Shambhalan to have their own metal water bottle, which they can use forever. And so we started up a little business, and it did okay. We sold bottles to Glastonbury and we sold them to a couple of other festivals. And it all did fine. There was obviously a bit of a blip during the pandemic when no one was going to any festivals. But we've got to a position now where there's a lot of people doing it. The business is sort of viable, but only in terms of just sort of washing its face. But it doesn't have any debt. There's a little bit of money left in the bank. There's only 3 shareholders who are broadly all in agreement. And so we agreed in the last board meeting to basically wind it up. And it's a lot more difficult than you think to wind up a business which is not in dire straits. It's like the system's geared up to sort of have the vultures that circle over the carcass of a failed entity, to the loss adjusters and everyone picking over the last bits of flesh on the bones, and usually in some kind of horrible legal dogfights, where different people are prioritized in terms of who gets paid out when. And I've really actually struggled, because you go to speak to a lawyer who would say, to give advice, and they go, so what's the problem? And I said, well, there isn't really a problem. I said, the business is still viable. It's done its job, and we've decided to give it a good ending. It's like, and no one can seem to give us really clear advice about the easiest way of doing this. The only thing we've got to pay off is a bounce back loan that we took out during the pandemic. So that's the only thing. None of us are going to make much money out of this. If anything, we'll all lose something. But when we do the final payout, we won't lose everything. But yeah, it's a real dilemma that I hadn't anticipated. It's much easier to wind up a fucked business as it is to wind up a business which is still alive.
Isn't that fascinating? And doesn't that tell us something about the assumptions, logics, etc., that we're operating within? And I'm thinking now, I'm going to record a Homeward Bound episode soon with my old friend Jay Cousins, partly because he has come up with, the 4 tasks for an age of endings at the end of At Work in the Ruins, which people have done lots of different things with. He's come with 4 more tasks, and it's a really fascinating list. So we're going to record an episode where we talk about that. But he's also one of the most imaginative people about, what else could the social institutions we call businesses be like? And he draws on, ecological examples for diversifying our thinking about how a group of human beings come together to do something, and what kinds of structures and lifespans and rhythms might be appropriate to different undertakings. So I'll try and get him talking a bit about that when we do that episode, because it feels really relevant to what you're talking about.
We kind of need, you have a death doula, that helps you do your transition. We kind of need the business equivalent of that. The business death doula that does the hospicing of your modern enterprise in a way that it creates the best after effect.
Well, we'll have to feed this back to Iona Lawrence and the Decelerator crew, because they're definitely experiencing a huge amount of demand for and use of the services they're providing in the third sector. But also, I think that they deliberately created that organization to have a 10-year lifespan, to create a field of practice where by the end of 10 years, there are lots of people with these skills, and there doesn't need to be this organization doing it indefinitely and seeking to grow and so on. But the other example that came to me when I was thinking about, how do I know this isn't the same as accelerationism from Brian, was I remembered a bit that came to me relatively recently when I was revisiting Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, which, some people will know is a book that I've drawn all sorts of stuff from over the years. It's this fascinating economic history of the changes going on in England on the run into and then through the course of the Industrial Revolution. It was written in the 1940s, in the middle of the Second World War, by this Hungarian economic historian. And there's a bit in it where he says, almost in passing, he talks about the role of the crown in relation to the enclosures in the late medieval and early modern period in England. And he says, historians, I'm not quoting this verbatim, but this is what stuck with me from it. Historians tend to assume that if they see something that failed, that it was futile. And so he's talking about the way in which, up to a certain point, you had Parliament pushing forward enclosure and the Crown acting as a brake on it, trying to resist it or slow it down. And he says, because in the end, the enclosures went ahead and transformed England, it's assumed that the Crown's efforts in resisting that, or at least the role that the Crown and other forces played in resisting that, was futile because it didn't succeed. And he said, but what if actually that's a really important function, because by slowing down the process, the damage resulting from that process was lessened. He's basically saying, if enclosure had gone full steam ahead, you might have just had wholesale societal collapse unfolding from it. By acting as a brake on it, by slowing it down somewhat, even if in the end you didn't succeed in preventing it happening, you may have played a really important role in that process, the damage being limited from that process. And I just think that's a really interesting image of one of the kinds of deceleration that might be worth working for.
Yeah. So it turns out in that Star Trek future, the Borg are fundamentally wrong and that resistance is not futile.
So I have one more bit that sort of fits with this, because it brings this back around to election analysis. And this is from Andrew, who writes the Substack Bogged Down and Aster, which is one of my favorite little corners of Substack. And this was the only thing I shared that was kind of response to the election, because it was the only thing that I found that was really kind of walking this brokenhearted edge in the way that, like, it's not that this is what I wanted to say, because I'm not there. Andrew's in Maine, and he's partly living it alongside his daughter as a young woman, living the heartbreak of what the possibilities and the outcomes of this election had meant for her. And that's part of what's coloring what he writes. But he has this quote from Gustav Landauer, who I didn't know anything about, the German anarchist thinker. I like this quote. He says, "The state is a condition, a certain relationship between human beings, a mode of behavior. We destroy it by contracting other relationships, by behaving differently toward one another. We are the state, and we shall continue to be the state until we have created the institutions that form a real community." And so then he comes back later on in the post to that line from Landauer, having voiced his ambivalence about some of the responses to the election. And he says in his voicing the ambivalence, he says, "Tell me again how the majority simply chose what would make their life more affordable, with no deep resonance for either misogyny or racism. I hear you. I too see neighbors among them and goodness. But the genius of Himmler, according to Hannah Arendt, was that he realized that people who had once had security and some semblance of wealth but lost it would get in line for anything to regain it. Be careful not to confuse understandable with honorable." And then here comes the bit where he brings back the Landau quote and mixes it up with the line that I'm always coming back to from Illich, where Illich says, "The limits of political possibility today are the number of people who can sit around a table and share a meal together." So this is Andrew. "Those communities prophesied by Landauer are, I think, like Illich's kitchen table, the limits of the political at world's end. Elections here and now are maybe more about the habitat in which those small togetherings will have to survive than they are about any lasting shelter in themselves. I don't know which niche is more likely to hasten the looked-for wonder of an us that can muster real change, the tempered or the brazen, and I don't feel a need to praise the devil by promising only doom beneath the sick flag of a fool. But I would have more than welcomed a shift of form, a following of woman for a change. Plus, dancing on the grave of makeshift dreams, making do with what they find in the wreckage, is bad table manners. And these scattered tables are where anything close to the end of such a state as this will be born."
Oh.
Maybe those are words on which to close for today. Thanks, Ed. It's always good to talk to you.
Likewise.
Thanks for listening to the Great Humbling podcast. You can find more at our website, homewardbound.org, where you can also subscribe to us on Substack. We're on Facebook as The Great Humbling, Ed is, I believe, still on the site formerly known as Twitter as @frucool. And if you'd like to spend more time with my work, then visit aschoolcalledhome.org and find out about the online series that we're hosting there. The title music for the podcast comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks again for listening.